All righty. So today we have a presentation on forgiveness, which is just in time for the holidays when we get together with people that we've been holding grudges against since the last holiday season. Today, Dr. Richard Lyon is going to give us a presentation. He's been in private practice as a marriage and family therapist since 1991. He received his Master's of Divinity degree from Fuller Seminary and his PhD in Human Development from Claremont Graduate University. Dr. Lyon treats individuals, families, and couples ranging in age from adolescents to senior adults, and he frequently integrates the principles of forgiveness in his approach to psychotherapy and mediation. He previously served as a pastor at Glendale Presbyterian Church and Trinity Presbyterian Church in North Hollywood. And he brings both a psychological and theological perspective to the topic of forgiveness. So take it away, Rick.
Okay, so all right. I'm going to share my screen. Let me see here. Okay, well, as Wayne said, I do come at this from both a theological and a psychological perspective, because I think that forgiveness is not just a moral mandate, but it is really a relational imperative and a psychological imperative, because it is therapeutic for the individual and for the network of relationships of which the individual is a part. So you'll see that I kind of interweave different theological and psychological perspectives from different theorists from those respective fields. But I do think that very often there is an overlap between the moral and the therapeutic, and I think this is one of those concepts which does overlap. So I want to start with Erik Erikson, who was a successor to Sigmund Freud. And instead of psychosexual stages, Erik Erikson developed psychosocial stages of development. And the developmental stage with which we are concerned today is stage 8, ego integrity versus despair. And let me see, Wayne, I'm getting the bar that's kind of in the way of my slides. I wonder how do I get that off?
I don't see it. Where is it?
Well, it's the bar that has mute, stop video, participants, chat, etc. down at the bottom. I'm wondering why I don't. Maybe I have a different.
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll just deal with it.
Yeah, is it covering your slide?
Well, it's covering the bottom part of my slide. I'll just roll with it.
Okay,
so,
I don't see it.
Ego integrity versus despair, some theorists would say, begins around age 55. So this is pertinent just in case any of you happen to be older than 55. Probably have some people out there fit that category. And it refers in Erikson's theory to the point in life where you start to look back and evaluate your life. And you try to come to terms with the life that you have lived and look back with a sense of satisfaction in connection with the ways in which you've fulfilled your ideals, you've lived out your dreams, you've lived in accordance with your moral code. That is what he refers to as integrity. And then despair is the other side of that, and that's a review that is tinged with regret and resentment as you look back. And Erickson's theory is kind of interesting because he doesn't posit integrity as the ideal and despair as the non-ideal. In fact, throughout the different stages of development, he believes that any successful negotiation of that developmental stage involves a balance. And so the basic strength that comes from ego integrity versus despair is the balance of regret and satisfaction, because nobody can look back on their lives and say that they never strayed from all they believe. Everybody has some measure of regret for having failed themselves, having failed others. And there's also a reality that we have satisfied our dreams, our goals in some ways. So it's not realistic, actually, to look back and say that our lives were a complete waste or that our lives were completely successful. Usually there's a recognition that there's been some good and there's some bad. And where this relates to forgiveness is that we have the opportunity to look back and recognize that we need to forgive others for our resentments, and forgive ourselves perhaps for our regrets in the ways that we failed ourselves. And satisfaction or integrity, as Erickson expresses it, brings a perspective that enables us to forgive ourselves and others, because our resentments, the ways in which people have failed us, have really not completely ruined our lives, and we have not completely failed ourselves. So we are then able to recognize that in some of our triumphs, we are better able to forgive ourselves because we have not been complete failures. So, there we go. So forgiveness is associated with some controversy, both in theological, but especially in psychological circles. It is often a concept that is misunderstood and misused. And I see this often to the detriment of the forgiver, because many believe that forgiveness entails giving up your own experience, giving up the pursuit of justice, or putting your safety in jeopardy. And these are misconceptions that I'm going to be dealing with as sort of the core of my presentation. Another misconception is that the motivation to forgive should be only the welfare of the forgiven or the larger community of which the forgiver and the forgiven are a part. And so what that leads to is this paradox, I believe, that I've often seen therapeutically, which is that we often most need to forgive those who tell us that we need to forgive. There are some theorists within the field of psychology who would say that forgiveness is actually counter-therapeutic. And I came across a couple of them in doing my doctoral dissertation on husbands of incest survivors. And Alice Miller, who is a famous author and psychoanalyst who's written a lot on the issue of trauma, sees forgiveness as an avoidance of accountability for the perpetrator. And she thinks it's a suppression of the truth that is the opposite of what should be done, and that is to maintain the outrage against the perpetrator. And she also would say that forgiveness, that is, stems from a fear of retribution. So Miller's concern overall is for justice. And then there's Judith Herman, who has also written a lot on trauma and recovery. The idea of forgiveness for her amounts to an avoidance of the hard work of recovery, specifically the hard work of grieving. And she sees that forgiveness is similar to its polar opposite, revenge, in that it's an attempt at empowerment. And it is specifically an attempt to triumph over the perpetrator by transcending hatred through love. And so the overall concern here for Herman is to be able to do the hard work of grieving. So those are two giants in the field of trauma who have a hard time understanding the value of forgiveness. At least they call it into question. And I would say, with all due respect to these renowned colleagues, that a healthy definition of forgiveness is consistent with the pursuit of justice. It does require grieving. It entails hard work, and it often heals the forgiver more than the forgiven. So I'm going to continue to develop that idea, and we'll talk a little bit about this as we talk about the stages of forgiveness. So forgiveness is something that arises from the experience of loss. When we have lost something of value to us, it is understandable, it is natural to seek restoration. And what gives rise to the need of forgiveness, among other things, is that perfect restoration is impossible. You can't regain a lost childhood. You can't regain your sense of well-being just by having someone pay for medical bills when you've been injured through another's negligence. And you could restore your stuff, for example, if you get burglarized, but that hardly replaces the sense of security that has been lost if you have been burglarized. So the experience of loss becomes more of a challenge for forgiveness with this lingering sense of being owed. And this gives rise to the use of the term debts and debtors that we find in the New Testament, or a psychoanalyst by the name of Fiumara talks about a generalized and persisting entitlement. And it is that lingering sense of being owed that can create an ongoing resentment that lasts way beyond the initial victimization. So what this often leads to is compensation as an alternative to restoration. And sometimes I will find people who seek compensation through a representative of the original perpetrator, somebody who is a new significant other in their lives. They will try to get a kind of compensation from that person and try to get something that represents the original loss. And so there are different forms of compensation. In the great American tradition, there's money. You can sue people, or you can believe that the perpetrator owes it to you to feel perpetually guilty, or you can feel like the world owes you. And so you can't be expected to meet adult demands and responsibilities because, after all, you've been wounded and you shouldn't have to to step up to the plate like everyone else because the world owes you. So in light of that, in light of the experience of loss underlying forgiveness, I would define forgiveness as essentially canceling the debt or canceling the expectation of compensation. And this becomes a practical necessity in view of the unlikelihood of compensation, the insufficiency of compensation, the agony of waiting for compensation, and also forgiveness can be motivated out of love for the forgiven. So let's talk about good things forgiveness is not in view of that central definition of forgiveness as canceling the debt, dropping the expectation of compensation. Forgiveness is not, among other things, excusing. Now, in our society, and probably all societies have a form of this, it's considered to be socially gracious to hear somebody say, "I'm sorry," and then for us to respond by saying, "That's okay." And that is absolutely necessary in certain situations where it is really okay. In light of mitigating circumstances, you decide it's not really morally wrong. But if something is actually morally wrong, if it really does hurt, then we can't just call right that which is wrong. So forgiveness really only comes into play when we are dealing with the inexcusable. Also, another thing that forgiveness is not is forgetting. And this is in the popular imagination because forgetting is linked to forgive and forget. And certainly there's some healthy functioning that requires forgetting. Like I get on the freeway and I forget about all the daunting possibilities that could happen. And I forget about the accidents that I've been in and the accidents perpetrated by others. And I get on the freeway anyway. And that helps me to get to my destination. I'm not absolutely paralyzed about all the things that could happen that have happened before. But healthy functioning also requires remembering. If it was hot when you touched it before, then there's a good chance it's going to be hot when you touch it again. So remembering can just be a practical necessity to keep you safe. And then one has to ask the question, forgetting for whose sake? Who is telling us that we need to forget? Is it the perpetrator, or is it someone who is somehow in league with the perpetrator, someone who thinks that the network of which you're a part, like the family, needs to function predicated on your forgetting what terrible thing has happened to you? And so forgetting is something that we should employ from time to time, but I think we should regard it with a healthy degree of suspicion when we're talking about it in connection with forgiveness. Also, a good thing that forgiveness is not is reconciling. Reconciling is a really good thing, and I would even say that it is the intended culmination of forgiveness, and it requires forgiveness. But I would also say this, and this is very important: forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. These are two separate decisions. You only need one participant for forgiveness. You alone can cancel the debt. You can drop your expectation of restoration or compensation, but two parties at least are needed for reconciliation. Reconciliation is predicated on some degree of agreement an agreement that a wrong was perpetrated, and the agreement by the perpetrator that a wrong was perpetrated is manifested by an apology, an attempt to make restitution, as inadequate as it would be. Still, it requires the participation of two parties. And there are times when, out of a calculation for your safety, it's just not possible to reconcile. So let's just talk about why people cannot forgive. And first, I want to make reference to the theories of Martha Stark, who is a psychoanalyst, and this draws upon a couple of different works of hers. She discusses three different defenses, and I call them compensatory defenses. That's my wording, but it seems to be warranted from the context of her theories, and it fits with the nomenclature we're using for this presentation. So there are three different defenses that she sees in her people: relentless hope, relentless outrage, and relentless despair. And I'm going to elaborate on each one of these compensatory positions. And all three of them are based on what Freud talked about as the repetition compulsion, the idea of reenacting the trauma with the hope of achieving a better outcome. So these, you could say, are three different ways people typically try to make up for past loss. So relentless hope is seeking compensation by compliance. It is an unconscious attempt to make the bad object good. And in this connection, object, a psychoanalytic term, you can just use very simply as a significant other. If you're in need of forgiving someone, then that someone normally is a significant person in your life, either beforehand or they became significant because of the pain that they caused you. So relentless hope is trying to rehabilitate that person, that significant other. And in this case, the repetition compulsion manifests as reenacting the trauma with the hope of receiving appreciation from the victimizer or his representatives. And so relentless hope can be confused with forgiveness. It looks a lot like forgiveness. And it is the victim taking on the burden to repair the relationship. So this coincides with a concept that comes from the substance abuse literature, codependency. The person is working really hard, working both sides of the relationship, you might say. And an example of this would be returning again and again to an abusive mate. And then there's relentless outrage, which is the attempt to seek compensation by aggression. And this is the unconscious attempt to punish the bad object, not rehabilitate them, punish them. So the repetition compulsion, as it applies to this particular position, is reenacting the trauma with the hope of acquiring power over the victimizer, or again, his representatives. And it looks like the opposite of forgiveness. This is the person who believes that by inflicting enough pain and punishment, the victim will compensate themselves for the victimization by becoming the powerful actor in the relationship. So a really classic example of this is when the abuse victim becomes the abuser. They make up for it, make up for feeling victimized, feeling helpless, by becoming the powerful one in either the original relationship or a subsequent relationship. And then there's relentless despair. And Stark puts less emphasis on this. She didn't develop this concept as much as the other two, but this is the outlook which seeks compensation by detachment. It's the attempt to really deny the need for the significant other. And the repetition compulsion here is reenacting the trauma with the hope of achieving safe distance from the victimizer or his representative. And so you can see this in the person who tries mightily to achieve enough self-sufficiency and solitude that the victim feels safe from would-be victimizers. So relentless despair doesn't look like the opposite of forgiveness, and it doesn't look like a caricature of forgiveness. It looks like it has nothing to do with forgiveness. And so the meta communication here, the entitlement is, I deserve to just be left alone based on what I've been through. And so an example would be someone who relates more to electronics than to people. So this is a good way to just summarize Martha Stark's defenses. The relentless hope, outrage, and despair you see on the left side of the table, and relational stance, compliance, aggression, and detachment, respectively. And then the sense of entitlement is I'm entitled to be appreciated, I'm entitled to be empowered, I'm entitled to safety. And the disowned attribute, the experience that the person is not trying to feel, trying to avoid feeling, is the feeling of resentment in the case of relentless hope, or fear in the case of relentless outrage, and neediness in the case of relentless despair. So I think you can see how those all sort of tie together. So I would go a little bit further than Stark does and say that the defenses to which she refers reflect legitimate needs. They each contain a grain of truth. And this, I think, properly understood, can help us recognize how forgiveness can be tough for us to achieve, because we feel like we're having to give up on getting appreciated or feeling empowered or feeling safe. And it explains the tenacity of the search for compensation in these different ways. And it also explains the tenacity of the search for compensation of the people who find it very difficult to forgive you. So let's just talk a little bit about the costs of non-forgiveness. Unforgiveness has been linked to a lot of medical issues, heart disease, ulcers, cancer, hypertension, strokes. And overall, what we see is an emotional and relational constriction, because the person is limited in how they can relate to other people. A character disorder is, or a personality disorder is that part of abnormal psychology, if you've taken a course, where you start to think, oh my God, I'm one of those. Oh no, I'm one of those. Oh no, I'm one of those. And so, you get to the end of the course, you think you have every personality disorder. And I think that that's because there are attributes in every personality disorder, whether it's narcissism or neurotic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder. You can go right through the list, and there's a grain of truth in all of those personality disorders. The problem comes when you can only run one play regardless of circumstances. When you're locked in to one way of interacting with the world and with other people, understanding yourself, that's when the pathology becomes destructive. And so that's what I'm referring to by talking about emotional and relational constriction. If you can only run one play, then that's trouble. And all of these costs of non-forgiveness are exacerbated by this relentless expectation. I've sort of added a fourth orientation that really captures all the three of Martha Stark's defenses that I previously explained. Frederick Luskin, who's written, he's a Jewish psychologist who's written a lot about forgiveness. He says, if what you wanted to have happen absolutely had to happen, that is the setup for great disappointment. And then Frederick Buechner, my second favorite Christian writer after C.S. Lewis, says this about non-forgiveness. Of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue the prospect of bitter confrontations to come, to savor to the last toothsome morsel both the pain you are given and the pain you are giving back. In many ways, it is a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that what you are wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. And this is very apropos of our coming up on the Thanksgiving feast. So to summarize that, I think we can see how anger and non-forgiveness is consuming. It eats us alive. And the hatred, while it consumes us, is often lost on the hated. As Anne Lamott puts it, not forgiving is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. So this leads to an argument for forgiveness that comes from simple empathy for yourself. There's room here to have empathy for why you cannot forgive and empathy for why you need to forgive. This is not necessarily an external mandate, and any external mandate is unlikely to be that persuasive anyway. The case for forgiveness emerges mostly from our own suffering. Our own suffering of not forgiving is the argument for forgiving. So let's just talk about forgiveness as a process. And I talk about this in terms of stages, and here I've been influenced by different thinkers, Judith Herman and Lewis Smedes, who is a theologian who was at Fuller Seminary when I was there, and also David Stoop, who was a psychotherapist who taught at Fuller when I was there. So I see it this way. First of all, forgiveness involves remembering, and remembering might seem like that's a no duh. Of course, you have to remember the offense committed against you, but this is not always as straightforward as it seems, because remembering is not always possible in terms that we can really put our finger on. There's a distinction that neurologists make between implicit and explicit memory. Implicit memory is like emotional memory that does not have words attached to it. So an example of an implicit memory would be a Vietnam vet who hears the backfire from a car and hits the ground. For that Vietnam vet, he's in Vietnam. Now, implicit memory becomes explicit memory when that vet can say, oh, that reminds me of Vietnam. But implicit memory, before it becomes explicit memory, can have a profound impact on us because it seems to be reality. It's seamless with the previous experience. And so there is no distinction to be made between past and present. They're all pulled together. And so if you feel threatened, you are threatened. And it's when we can make that distinction between the there and then and the here and now, we're better positioned to be able to forgive because we realize that we are safe now. We're in a better position. And we can live our lives without the looming threat of being abused by an abuser who is bigger and stronger and was someone on whom we depended. We're no longer in that situation. And so being able to remember is pretty important to gain some control over those traumatic memories. And then there's grieving. And here I would refer you to the stages of grief that are outlined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, among other people. And she talks about the stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And one of the points that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross makes in her book on death and dying is that these are stages that people don't proceed through in lockstep. So once you get past denial, you never go back to denial. No, it's messy. And Judith Herman refers to this in a slightly different way by talking about how grieving can feel like a descent into mourning, which feels like a surrender to tears that is endless. So this is why people aren't up for grieving and then aren't really up for facing what they need to forgive. And then what I see as sort of the core of forgiveness as a process is rethinking. It's being able to see the victimizer, for example, as also a victim. To see that the person who wounded you was also wounded, and their woundedness may have a lot to do with how they wounded you. But it could also mean seeing yourself as a victim who is also a victimizer. It makes it easier for you to forgive when you recognize you've done wrong as well, that you have some complicity perhaps in the interaction which was very hurtful to you. Now, I put this caveat in here. This is only really true in symmetrical relationships. I would not counsel someone who has been abused as a child to see themselves also as a victimizer. A child doesn't have agency, doesn't have independence, and doesn't have the cognitive wherewithal to be able to act in the same way as an adult. So to do that, to get the child, even as an adult, to see themselves as a co-victimizer is completely therapeutically inappropriate and even downright destructive. And then another way of rethinking is to think about this family systems concept of circular versus linear causation. And the way one family systems theorist talks about this is the concept of punctuation. How you punctuate the sentence that describes a conflict will reveal your assignment of victim and victimizer respectively. So the first sentence there, Marcia complains, John withdraws. That's John's rendition of what is happening. Marcia complains, and then John withdraws in reaction to her complaining. which therefore gives the semblance of legitimacy to John's withdrawal, because after all, it came after Marcia's complaining. But then you could just as easily put the period after Marcia complains, and that then depicts Marcia's view of events. John withdraws, and then that gives rise to her legitimate, understandable, natural reaction of Marcia complaining. And so the idea of punctuation in family systems theory is that there is no punctuation. There's no beginning and ending to a circle. And so the question of who started it really becomes irrelevant. You can't assign moral superiority according to chronology. So recognizing the cyclical nature of our interactions can help us to loosen our designation of victim and victimizer. And that can then help us to forgive the other, because we realize our own involvement in our own pain. And all of this rethinking also applies to forgiving oneself, being able to see that you not only did wrong, but wrong was done to you. That can help. And then another aspect of rethinking is to recognize that we often deny the intentionality in ourselves that we ascribe to our enemy. So we tend to be determinists when we describe our own behavior. We say things like, well, I couldn't help it. Like, he made me feel X. And then when it comes to describing the other's behavior, we say, well, he deliberately hurt me. And so we're moralists when we're describing somebody else's behavior, and then we're determinists when we describe our own behavior. And so rethinking involves, I believe, a recognition of both agency and causation. There are things that cause us to feel certain ways that cause a reaction, or at least influence our reaction, but we still have choice. So empathy, if we can use it to understand and appreciate the other person's position and their experience, can generate a positive reciprocity. And without giving that understanding, we're not as likely to get understanding. And what I often see is that empathy is really underlying even the most outrageous of behaviors. There are ways in which people act to make a person feel what they are feeling. And in psychoanalysis, there's even a term for this. It's called projective identification, which is, in some cases, a very arcane and very complicated concept, but it basically amounts to this. Now you know how it feels. We make other people feel what we're feeling so that they know what we feel. That's projective identification. And that is universal. And really, at the bottom of it is people will, in especially intimate relationships, will often press hard to be understood. And what happens as the desperate bid to be understood and to make the other person feel what you feel, what often happens is that the person acting in that way feels increasingly misunderstood. So it backfires. And this, of course, presents a great challenge when you're faced with extreme coping strategies. But I would just suggest that you take it as an article of faith, that underneath the most desperate, the most destructive behaviors, there is often a seeking to be understood, to have people know and appreciate what the other person is feeling. And then this is where we get to forgiveness proper, as I would see it, where we cancel the debt. And this involves accepting the inadequacy of infantile, contemporary, and transference objects, as Martha Stark put it. So accepting the insufficiency of people in your lives, primary caregivers, friends and family in your adult life, people on whom you rely on in a mentoring relationship. Transference refers to what happens between psychotherapist and patient, but transference can happen in other relationships with people with whom we have a relationship of great dependency or even interdependency. So accepting the inadequacy, accepting the humanness, in other words, of our relationships, past, present, that has a lot to do with being able to cancel the debt. And then canceling also involves, as we said before, deciding that compensation is implausible and or unsatisfying. Now, I would say this might be a bit controversial among my colleagues, but I think it's completely consistent with forgiveness to get what compensation you can. That's fine. If you can satisfy the demands of justice to some extent, that's progress. That's moving the ball down the field. But you must face the ultimate inadequacy of compensation. It will never make up for what you have experienced, what you have lost. And Henderson, who's done a lot of research on the sense of closure, as it's often called, and the death penalty, has found that the death penalty did not provide the closure for the friends and family of murder victims. Just didn't really cut it. And actions can change thought and feeling, just as thought and feeling can change actions. And so this is a sort of a caveat to the part of the process I described as rethinking. Sometimes you need to act in advance of changing your thinking, and the action will change the way you think and feel. In Western society, there's a great emphasis on changing the way you think, and that will then presumably change the way you feel and change the way you behave. But in my clinical experience, I see again and again how it works in reverse, that you change your behavior and that changes the way you think and feel. So as C.S. Lewis put it, it's either C.S. Lewis or Frederick Buechner, I can't remember which one, says that you cannot love someone for very long without, in the end, coming to like them as well. And so one of the ways which you can do that if you come from a religious tradition is you can pray for somebody. You can actively wish them well, and that can change the way you think and feel about them. And that is, for Lewis Smedes, the test of whether or not you've canceled the debt. Can you wish them well, even if you have to wish them well from afar, because reconciliation is not a possibility? So I promised I would elaborate on reconciliation. Forgiveness can happen without reconciliation. I think it's the goal, it's the ideal, but reconciliation requires agreement. And reconciliation usually requires confrontation, because let's think about it. If someone is clueless enough to hurt you in the first place, then they're probably going to need to be clued in as to how they hurt you. And you cannot presume that they just necessarily understand either that they hurt you or how much they hurt you. But this involves calculating the safety or a lack of safety of reconnecting. Is it really safe to go back into that relationship? And that's not always easy to know in advance. Sometimes you try it out and you find out, no, it's not going to work. And the reconciliation, if it does happen, is dependent upon agreement that a wrong was done, and the victimizer then responds in a way that is consistent with that agreement. And so how likely it is that the victimizer will agree is a consideration in deciding whether or not to attempt reconciliation. And I think it's also possible, though, to have reconciliation that is incomplete. It's always going to be incomplete. It's never going to be perfect. You're never going to share exactly the same perception. And this is what Walter Brockelmans, who's written a lot about couples therapy, talks about when he is referring to stepping across the perceptual divide. No two people will agree on the same event, even if it happened just a few minutes ago. And that does not need to stand in the way of empathy. You can still say, based on how you saw things, I can see how you felt the way that you did. And you don't have to agree on a common view of past history. That will just get in the way. So the fruit of forgiveness, I think, is the restoration of balance. If Stark's compensatory defenses each contain a grain of truth, then it seems to me that health consists of drawing upon that grain of truth in restoring balance. And here I am, sorry, I'm struggling here to plug in my computer before I lose you all. There's also a theorist by the name of Karen Horney, and even with that unfortunate surname, she does have a theory that dovetails quite well with Martha Stark's defenses, and with the idea that there is a grain of truth in each of those stances. And so for Horney, moving toward coincides quite well with relentless hope. Moving against coincides with relentless outrage, and moving away is very much like relentless despair. And for Horney, the goal is, again, to achieve balance. Hers was a positive psychology. How do we move toward health? And so this is one of the ways in which she broke from her predecessor, Freud, by talking about what is health rather than just talking about what is pathology. And so she saw those three as very much a summary of how we are healthy. There are times when we move to connect with others. There are times when we compete with others, or we confront them, or we stand alone. And there are times when we have to move away. We have to find solitude and get away from the influence of others. And I see those as all coming together under the different virtues. Moving toward and relentless hope can have at their best the virtue of compassion. And relentless outrage, moving against, can manifest at their best as courage. And relentless despair and moving away can be the source of wisdom. So I think it is fair to say that forgiveness both requires and generates these virtues of compassion, courage, and wisdom. And it might not seem immediately obvious that forgiveness requires courage, but I think that when we see it as an act of defiance, as a resisting the urge to fight, take flight, or to freeze, or resisting the psychological urge to belong or the social pressure to conform, then we can see that if we strike a balance between moving toward, moving against, and moving away, that we'll be resisting some of these urges. I think when we look at this all together, we see that forgiveness is really a way of becoming. It is a way of being. Resentment and revenge are just so cliche, and I'm only being somewhat facetious about that. I think it is so much the rule, and forgiveness is so much what is unexpected. And that here, my own field of psychotherapy has been somewhat complicit in standing in the way of forgiveness, because theories of causality, especially in psychoanalysis, can unfortunately become laws of inevitability. That because this caused this, it could not be any other way. And sometimes those theories of causation can take away our sense of choice. And Hannah Arendt elaborates on this concept. In contrast to revenge, which is the natural automatic reaction to transgression, which can be expected and even calculated, the act of forgiving can never be predicted and frees from its consequences both the one who forgives and the one who is forgiven. Living with incomplete forgiveness is necessary, I think, as a predicate to even move toward forgiveness. If we accept the imperfection to start with, then we're more likely to make efforts toward forgiving and toward reconciling. It's never complete. And Fiumara, another psychoanalyst, talks about this as the creative labor that is no happy ending genre. It is a never-ending, soul-making, maturational, challenging story. And here, I want to, let me see if I can.
I sort of feel that way some days.
Okay. So, whoops. I show this because this is not supposed to happen. Forgiveness is not supposed to happen. The way of the world is transactional relationships. You take something from me, I want to make you pay somehow. And what is so transformational about forgiveness, especially when it comes to a culmination of reconciliation, is that it is so exceptional. It is so shocking. Yet it is within our power to do it. You can be the one who takes away the burden of guilt carried by another, and you can take away the burden of resentment you carry yourself. So let me take questions at this point.
Okay, so let me just, there's just two things in the chat. Let me take care of those. One's by me. The first one is, Susan would like you to put up the screen again that shows the quote, "If what you wanted to have had happened."
Yeah, Frederick Luskin.
I think she wanted to write it down. And then while you're doing that, I put in a note that popped up in my mind. When I used to work with patients with dementia, it wasn't unusual for the adult children to tell me that since the person lost their memory, they were much more pleasant than they used to be.
Mm.
And it seemed like all the old resentments and so forth had disappeared. And I'm just wondering if maybe one of the treatments for forgiveness can be erasing your memory.
Yeah, I think that there's a sense in which you do forget, you move forward with you do move forward as though the event didn't happen. And I think remembering, on the other hand, can be a source of wisdom if you don't want to get in a situation like that again, either with the original perpetrator or with someone else. So remembering can come in handy for the sake of safety, but it can also be very therapeutic to forget and to treat the person as though it did not happen. And I think that there's another aspect of forgetting that makes some sense. The tendency for any one of us when we've been traumatized is to generalize that experience and to expect to be treated subsequently the way we were treated previously. And when we view with suspicion everyone as a potential perpetrator, then we are remembering too well, you might say. So we have to instead teach ourselves that not everybody is a potential victimizer.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to the floor. So if you have something to say, just unmute yourself and go ahead and say it.
Thank you for putting up that slide, Richard.
Okay.
I have, and the reason, as I reread it, it makes me think of a way I forgave my brother, and it has to do with expectations. So my brother refuses to drive up here. I mean, for the last 10 years, he won't come to see me. I always have to drive to Long Beach. That's just, we'll make plans, they'll cancel it, something better came up. And I was so angry for years and years and years until I changed my expectation, because when I go down there, they treat me like a queen. It's just, I don't know what the issue is. We never discussed it, but I was so angry and I knew I didn't want to lose the relationship with my brother. So I gave it up, and now I've lost all my anger and we've become much closer. And I don't know where that fits into, if that, I think it's sort of forgiveness, but it has to do with my expectation.
Yeah, I do think that fits because it fits with what I said in specific about accepting the inadequacy of the people who are important to us, and that kind of perspective can be a cure for resentment. If your expectations are too high, if they're too unreasonable, that's a setup for being chronically disappointed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And very often the high expectations actually obscure what is good about the relationship. And when you recognize that when you go down there and you get treated like a queen, that helps to assuage your resentment about having them cancel, having them never come up to see you. And so it's there's a phrase that I often use in couples therapy. It's a quote from Harville Hendricks, who's written a lot about couples. And he says that when you stub your toe, the whole world becomes hurt toe. When you're in pain, it's hard to see anything else. And it's that lack of perspective that leads to some destructive outcomes, like you give up the relationship because it's not perfect.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody?
You know, I hold up a book that I had taken a course from Lewis Meads at Fuller, and this goes back in the 80s, I think, Forgive and Forget. So I appreciate your walking through your whole syllabus there of how that fits together, because a lot of nuggets that were gained before have been reinforced with what are the words that you've said. And it's just a tricky time right now with Thanksgiving. I think, Susan, and what you're, with your sharing your brother's story as we gather at Thanksgiving, and wonderful family members that I have that we are very much not on the same page a lot of the time. And so as I enter the Thanksgiving dinner scenario coming up in Colorado soon, I'm thinking about tempering my expectations of what's going to happen there, because it's
Yeah,
it's not an easily solved scenario there, but good information there, and thank you.
And I think Prakash has his hand up.
I have a simple question. For example, like in the case of Susan, how can the brother, what is the good way for the brother to ask for forgiveness?
Yeah. Well, that would be nice. It sort of assumes the brother is aware he needs to be forgiven. But I think I would put the onus on Susan, frankly, and say, if what you told me is any indication, it sounds like he's not aware that he's really committed any offense against you by not coming up to you, always expecting you to come to him, canceling at the last minute. And so that's why reconciliation usually requires some kind of confrontation. And confrontation is something that could be a subject in itself, because the confrontation can be a mixed bag. You can say, you know, on the one hand, I really appreciate how you treat me when I come down there, and you just roll out the red carpet, treat me like royalty. On the other hand, it'd be nice if you would come up my way sometimes. You know, I don't drive freeways. It's a long drive. And so I just know that about Susan. Anyway, that is, that's bringing a balance and a realism to the confrontation.
Right.
So you're not defining him entirely by his failure to live up to your expectations.
Right. I will say one little thing I want to add is, when my husband died, he did come up and he went to Forest Lawn with me, and he was a great help. So it's not that he will never come up. It's just they don't want to drive. They don't want to make the drive, is what I think. They would rather me be in their home where they're comfortable. So I don't feel the need to bring it up with him, because I feel good about the relationship now, which is what's good for me.
Ron, you had your hand up, but
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the presentation. I have a question, or maybe a further explanation of something I didn't quite understand.
Okay.
One of the slides of forgiveness as a process, canceling, accepting inadequacy of infantile, contemporary, and transferent objects. I didn't understand what that was.
Yeah, that was Martha Stark, the psychoanalyst's terminology, but I just translated that to mean accepting the inadequacy of your significant others, whether it's past or present, and accepting that they're not perfect becomes a way of giving up your resentment, because on balance, maybe the relationship is worth continuing. And
okay, I got it. Thank you very much.
Sure.
does anybody have an example of a successful act of forgiveness in their own life? Oh, sounds like we get some potential clients for you, Rick.
I don't have one of those, but I did put something in the chat box, which is another
Oh, you did?
question, the problem as it relates to forgiveness in a family situation.
Oh, right. I see it now. I'm sorry. I've neglected the chat. Is there any reason to continue a relationship with a sibling who for many, many years tells a family story where he is or she is the hero, and her four siblings are always the ones who are have wronged? A majority of the stories are fiction, not truth.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it does then bring up the necessity of making a distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation. You can forgive somebody from afar. You can do that unilaterally. It's within your power to drop your expectation of someone making it up to you. But there are times when reconciliation is really not an option. And, you know, Doobie, you're on the front lines, so you know what the prospects would be of confronting that sibling and trying to get an understanding. Might not happen. And sometimes I have said
it hasn't happened. It all four of us at various times have tried in different ways to get over this long-standing, call it family feud,
yeah,
but nothing works. And so the discussion amongst the four of us is we should just give up, because her story just gets longer.
yeah. And I think that you're better positioned than anyone, or you and your two other siblings are best positioned to know whether you've tried. If you've given it a shot and nothing has worked, then maybe that needs to be taken seriously as a basis for deciding to have someone somewhat on the periphery of your life. I think just as forgiveness is messy and imperfect, so is reconciliation. There are times when we can let somebody into our lives enough to be polite with them, like maybe we can have Thanksgiving dinner with them, but then we go away until next Thanksgiving, and we can have a relationship where they're not allowed all the way into our lives, but they're still connected. I have often said to my clients that they need to find a de facto family, because their family is not really their significant others. They need to find the people who are their true community, rather than feeling an obligation by blood or by marriage to make it right with another party at all costs. Sometimes it's just not possible.
Mhm.
So I think it frees us from unforgiveness if we're not forcing ourselves into reconciliation.
Okay. And then the final comment in the chat, and then we'll have to wrap it up, I think. Tommy says, thank you for your presentation. Forgiveness is a choice, and we all have the option to do so. And then I always tell people that we can put our expectations on someone and expect them to rise up to them. Then she amends it, meant to say we can not put our expectation of someone and expect them to rise up to what those expectations are. I'm not sure if that makes any sense.
I
May have
have a
mangled it.
quick question. I just wanted to say sometimes it's harder to forgive someone who's perpetrated something on someone you care about a lot. It's easier for me to forgive something that's happened to me, but when somebody does something to someone I care about, that's
Yeah.
harder.
Yeah,
It's interesting. Yeah.
yeah. It is harder, and it's it is easier to feel outraged on behalf of someone else, whereas if you're conscientious, you might be a little suspicious of your own outrage when it comes to your own victimization, because you might think, well, I'm just maybe acting a little bit selfishly here. But when it comes to someone else, it might feel more like a just cause to defend them, and hence a greater reluctance to forgive.
Hmm. And getting back to Tommy's comment, because I feel like I mangled it a little bit. I think she's saying that expecting somebody else to do something and just assuming that they're going to rise to that expectation is probably a little unrealistic. Especially when you explain to somebody what your expectation is and they express, and this is my comment, total surprise that you feel that way. I mean, it didn't even occur to them that you were expecting this from them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's that could be a source of great damage in relationships when the expectations are unspoken. And so there's disappointment that is never fully expressed, and yet you can still feel an unease in the relationship that you can't quite put your finger on. So that's pretty hard to deal with. It's pretty hard to have a confrontation that is completely in the dark.
Hey,
Okay,
Rick,
well,
thank you for showing that excerpt from The Mission. That was such a great movie. And my very favorite song in the world, almost one of them, is Gabriel's Oboe, which was being played at the end of that clip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. We're actually past our time. So I want to thank everybody for participating in this forgiveness. And it is being recorded. In fact, I should shut it off.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Rick.